My name is Barry Walsh, and I'm the Director of Editorial Strategy at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm one of the producers of Education Now. And I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. But first, I want to let you know that we are recording today's conversation, and it will be available for later viewing on YouTube and Facebook. And you can visit our website at hgse.me/ednow for recordings and information about future episodes. And you can submit your questions, because we do want to hear your questions, using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And you will find also closed captioned access at the bottom of the screen as well. And now I'm delighted to welcome our guests. Elizabeth Bonawitz has been named the David J. Vitale Associate Professor of Learning Sciences at HGSE, a position that she will step into in the new year on January 1st. Elizabeth is a developmental psychologist and a computational cognitive scientist who is a prolific scholar and researcher in her field. We're thrilled also to welcome Geneviève DeBose, who has spent nearly 20 years teaching and learning alongside middle school students in Los Angeles. And I like how you put it, alongside, in Oakland and in the South Bronx. Geneviève believes that education is a tool for social justice, and that learning experiences for children should be culturally relevant and student-centered. And then we have Jal Mehta, who is a professor of education here at HGSE. And Jal, wonderful to have you back. Jal's research explores the role of different forms of knowledge in tackling major social and political problems, and particularly problems of human improvement. He's written extensively on what it would take to improve American education, with a particular focus on the professionalization of teaching. So please join me in welcoming all of our guests. And let me shift right into this. In this challenging year, we've reached a challenging point, which is that early winter time when things are getting real, at least in my household with my 8th grade student and his motivation and his engagement. And you know, I think whether we're all virtual, whether we are hybrid, whether we are mostly in person, engagement this year is really the big challenge. But I've noticed that my student has endless engagement with his Minecraft games, and an endless level of curiosity about how to play Minecraft better. So Elizabeth, I want to start with you and ask, is it the case that students are either curious about school and school subjects, or they're not? I'd love to hear you talk about what you have learned from your research into learning and curiosity.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm really excited to chat today and also to hear more from Geneviève and Jal. But as a basic science researcher, one of the things I struggle to understand is just defining what curiosity is in the first place. So one way that we think about curiosity is it's a drive like hunger or thirst. And it's something that allows us to drive our attention and our cognitive resources towards opportunities for learning. So we like to think about as scientists and as developmental scientists, we know that actually curiosity is something that is present at birth. It's present in all children. It's what allows us to be the great thinkers that we all are as human beings, and it gets us learning very rapidly. So yes, we all have lots of curiosity. The question is, what about curiosity for school subjects and getting involved in school? And so I just want to say sort of 3 things about that, I think, because I think that there's some misconceptions around curiosity and early childhood. So the first is that as of right now, there's no evidence that you could foster curiosity generally as a trait, but we do know that there are things you can do to foster a student's interest in a particular topic at a particular time. And those are things like you can highlight ambiguity, you can help students recognize gaps between their current knowledge and the evidence in front of them. And you can get children and students to generate predictions and explanations. And by sort of recognizing the difference between what they currently know and what the evidence is showing them, you can bolster curiosity in the moment for that topic. And we also know things like the kinds of ways that we think about measuring curiosity, or where we see curiosity, isn't always measuring curiosity. So there's lots of children who are curious about lots of things, but don't necessarily know that they can or should express it. So again, figuring out ways to foster question asking, to demonstrate curious behaviors by asking questions yourself are ways that help open the pathway for children to be able to express or know that they can express their curiosity. And the final thing is just to say we might not always want to foster curiosity. There are times when it's not necessarily good to be too curious. If you spend your time thinking about one thing too much, then you might not be able to just learn new content and focus on whatever's happening in the school situation. So those would be the 3 take-home messages I think I would want to share for parents and educators as they're thinking about how does curiosity work in my student or in my child.
That's great. I love that. And Geneviève, you've kind of thought about this from the classroom perspective, and I think there's a lot that Elizabeth just said that kind of will spark things in you. I'm wondering what you think motivation looks like in students, and maybe what people get wrong when they think about what a motivated learner kind of is or needs, and just even that word motivated, what that is commonly used to describe, and sort of what you think that needs to look like.
Yeah. Well, I also want to say thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited for this conversation. And when I think about, piggybacking off of what Elizabeth said, that, they're similar to curiosity with motivation. Every kid is motivated, right? But what are different kids motivated to do and why, right? And that's really our job as educators to figure that out. And that's the puzzle. That's what I love about being an educator, is that I'm always trying to figure out, how am I going to hook a particular kid to really love reading, writing, debating, and all of that. And when I think about motivation, I think a lot about connection, because this notion of feeling connected to my peers, to my teachers, to the content, to the tasks that I'm being asked to perform, to my life experiences. If I don't have that connection, I have found in my, many years in middle school, that if kids cannot connect to what they are learning and the people that are around them, they are far less likely to be motivated to actually engage and learn. And, thinking about this year in particular, I think about a student at our school who had a deep connection with one of their teachers. And due to a schedule change, they got moved out of that teacher's class. And that kid advocated for themselves to get back into that class because they felt some sort of connection to that teacher, which is going to impact, what they're willing to do in this virtual space. And I think back also to the spring when we were all, trying to figure this out, and our teachers were teaching a unit on the power of music. And it was after the murder of George Floyd, and one of our 8th graders wrote in their Google Classroom, with all due respect, why are we learning about music when we should be talking about what's happening in the street? And what happened to George Floyd. And so does that child was motivated to learn and discuss and debate what was happening in the world? Were they connected to the content and the topic? So for me, when I think a lot about motivation, I think of connection, and how do students really see themselves, their interest, and people that they feel safe with. What Elizabeth shared around asking questions and feeling safe to ask questions, you have to have an environment in a classroom where asking questions is encouraged, and no one's going to laugh at you for whatever type of question you ask. So do you feel connected enough to your peers and your teachers to do that?
I love that. I think it's so important the way that you just sort of played out this nuance of connection, both to people, and to the topic, that both forms of connection have to be honored. I hope we can talk a little more about that as we go on. Jal, I know that that's something that you will be well familiar with as you've thought about schooling in kind of in this broad lens in which you've looked at it. I'd love to hear from you about what you think schools may be getting right or wrong when it comes to ways that they can be enabling and supporting motivation or connection or the innate curiosity that kids have. What kind of levers would you suggest that schools and school leaders should really be pushing around this?
Great question, Barry, and thanks for having me. And Elizabeth and Geneviève, great to be on with you. I think one thing we've learned from the pandemic is that kids are very different, and they respond in lots of different ways. There's some evidence in the spring in particular that teens' mental health improved a little bit in the time they were out of school, like on average, which doesn't mean that that's true for all students. It doesn't mean it's equally distributed. But I think that's because for some kids, sort of going to school and performing is difficult, and it brings anxiety, and they got more sleep. The researchers think that the sleep was a big part of it, and the sort of times of day that schools start. I was pretty surprised that a lot of schools this year, knowing that they were going to be online and knowing that there weren't going to be sports after school, didn't shift schedules a little later in the day, because there's a lot of good reasons to do that. So I think some kids have really liked being able to use the chat and not having a different modality with which to communicate with their teachers. So I think one thing we've really learned this year is that school is a very kind of one size fits all proposition, and pausing school in its sort of normal form has given rise to the fact that kids learn well under lots of different circumstances. And so I think trying to recognize and honor that is important. For principals, I mean, I think teachers are just under a sort of tremendous burden this year. All the evidence we have suggests that it just is a lot more time consuming to teach online. Some teachers are being asked to teach both in person and online simultaneously, and that has not gone well, not surprisingly. So I think trying to simplify and streamline things as much as possible, lessen testing where possible, create opportunities for teachers to go to their students and be able to, as Geneviève was suggesting, adapt to current events, enable students to propose different ways into topics. Your Minecraft example is one, but just sort of like enabling more variety and responsiveness seems to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, and that a lot of what you just said kind of begs the question of what we will learn from this year and maybe take with us in things that we've always wanted to do around understanding that education should be more personally suited to individual kids. But so welcome more thoughts on that. But I did want to just kind of throw out to the group that so much of children's own agency is being required this year. At least, children are and educators too, I guess, are really having to sort of just operate remotely in this setting where they're responsible for their time, they're responsible for their organization, without the structures that we typically are able to rely on, whether those structures work or not. I'm just wondering what you all think are the challenges around that. And I don't know, Geneviève, you may be the one who's most closely affiliated with or able to observe those. So I'd love to hear what everyone thinks about the challenges of missing that structure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to Joel's point around every kid is different, right? And there are some students who are really thriving in this environment. I know for myself and my students at my school and the teachers that I'm working to support their kids, we've got a lot of kids who are missing that structure. And even in I see my teacher twice a week synchronously, and I have work to do on my own. The work to do on your own is not really happening, at least what we're finding. And part of that, I think, is also because, these are middle schoolers, and those are skills that they are usually cultivating in an in-person setting with the support of their peers and many educators. And for some of them, missing that in-person connection is huge in terms of being able to develop those skills. But for others, they have other responsibilities. You know, they are caring for younger siblings. They are sadly struggling with COVID in their homes, or, you know, family members and food insecurity, or losing homes. So there are many pieces around, you know, the loss of the school day in terms of basic needs like food, but then also in terms of how can I grow as a young adolescent in this time and learn some of those life skills that are going to help me through high school and college.
Mm-hmm. And so, and Joel and Elizabeth, please jump in if you have other lenses on what some of these challenges are, but I'd love to have your thoughts on what we should be focusing on now as we move into kind of what seems like the second half of the year, even though by the calendar we still have a lot more year left to go. But winter break is a time, I think, to assess and what can we be focusing on if the goal is to try to drive this is to remediate or try to drive this engagement as much as we can in the circumstances.
Joel, would you like to take that one, or I can?
I don't know. It seems like your turn to go next. So, but I can if you want.
Well, I'd be happy to just backtrack for a second as we think towards the future and just speak a little bit more towards the point that Geneviève made about connection, because I think that well, let me just to back up for a moment from the sort of scientific theoretical perspective. We know a lot about why and how learning unfolds the way it does, and why teaching in particular is actually so effective in many cases, beyond just learning on your own. And it has to do with the inferences that learners are making about what the teacher knows about them. And so there's sort of computational principles. These are big jargony words, but there's good theory out there for understanding that a learner can rapidly learn from a teacher when the teacher has accurate representation of their beliefs. The learner can say, oh, they're choosing the best evidence for me. And similarly, in my own lab, we're doing studies on rapport and connections with teachers. And we're finding that when a child thinks that the teacher doesn't have a good understanding of their abilities, it totally shapes what kinds of exploration and projects they think they can then pursue that the teacher recommends for them. And there's good scientific principles behind why children are really making rational inferences there. So the concern about the pandemic and the recent experiences is that it's removing children from a lot of that one-on-one time with their teachers that allows them to establish that understanding and that belief that the teachers do have a good understanding of them and a good understanding of their knowledge. And of course, rapport is important for lots of social and emotional development pieces too, but just from a cognitive learning perspective, believing that your teacher doesn't know enough about you or about your beliefs can have radical implications for how you then pursue projects that are laid out for you, make inferences from the data that they're presenting to you, and pursue additional questions. So I think that's one of the big things we have to think about going forward into the spring, is how to make sure teachers are establishing that understanding with the students, creating that kind of rapport, that connection that Geneviève was talking about.
Barry, I think that's a really difficult question to answer across the variety of contexts that our listeners are in. And so I think organizationally, we've had long enough to sort of see how well the model that we put together over the summer for this year is working. And so I think the sort of like the thing to do is to like create enough space and time to let teachers and students tell you like how well that is going for them, and think about what sort of changes would make sense. I mean, there are a lot of learners out there who are, who are logged off, who are intermittently joining, and so I think talking to those students and trying to understand like what sorts of questions or programs of study might, make them willing to participate in the spring. I mean, from if students are really kind of disconnected to school from last March through this May, there's like the learning loss, but there's also like, you know, a lot of the students may never like really fully come back, especially who are in 9th and 10th grade. And so trying to connect to those students and understand like what could work for this year. There's a thing called Shadow a Student, which was devised when students were in physical school, where adults basically spent a day sitting in the seats of students. And they found that students got talked at a lot, that they didn't have enough opportunities to eat, to move around, few opportunities to speak or take agency or understand why they were learning what they were learning, etc. And I would be really interested to see what a sort of like shadow a student would look like in this environment and what sorts of changes that might provoke.
That would be incredible. I love that idea. And I think the empathy that generates too is incredibly powerful. One of the things that we are getting questions about from our audience right now is the issue of adult curiosity and adult motivation. And I think that's, and I wonder, maybe Elizabeth, you might have something to say, but you all might. Geneviève, you may have tried, been working with educators in your circle to kind of draw this out. Is what's the connection there, I wonder, between, an educator or an adult curiosity and that of their students?
Well, we definitely know there's work coming out of labs like Jamie Giroux and others that when teachers and adults model curiosity behaviors, when they model question asking themselves, we're well aware of the promise of inquiry-based learning and approaches like that, that it does promote, it does lower the barriers, I think, for students to feel like they themselves can now ask questions and be engaged. So I think, I know in my own research, we have an idea called pedagogical questions, where when the teacher is asking a question as a tool for teaching. So the student knows that the teacher knows the answer, but they can infer that they're asking because they're trying to be helpful and get the student to engage. That actually engages students in terms of, at least preschoolers and young children in our data. It engages them with the material more. It gets students to learn and retain the material. It gets children exploring toys longer and showing more variable play. And so that kind of question asking from an adult, when it's in the form of a sort of pedagogy practice, really does generate good inferences on behalf of the learner that encourage them to explore and discover and has impact on their learning of material and longer term retention. So that would be one thing I would recommend. And do you?
Yeah. I just want to add to that. We've been doing a lot of work at my school, and also I'm part of a network of schools in Los Angeles called the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. And we've been doing a lot of work with Dr. Goldie Muhammad's book, Cultivating Genius. And really, we've been having even today, I was in a meeting where we were having conversations about, do teachers see the genius within themselves, right? Like, are teachers seeing their own curiosity, their own intellect, their own identity? Because similar to what Elizabeth just said, what we model is what kids, emulate. And so just really ensuring, I want to say just to teachers right now, if there's any teachers listening and here, that what we are doing right now is so incredibly hard, and we are doing really good work. And I have not seen as many of my colleagues more demoralized in any of my 20 years as they've been in this year. And so to really remember and recognize for ourselves that this is not permanent, this is temporary, and we really are curious geniuses working in a really difficult situation. So just to remember that for ourselves, because when we believe it for ourselves, we can share it with our students.
Absolutely. I think that is such an incredible point. I completely agree. I think teachers are just our heroes right now. That I'm going to count as your pivot point, Geneviève, because I know we're coming right up on time, and I asked you guys to think about what one pivot point would you suggest could be made? What's feasible? I think the idea of, remembering one's own genius is a great pivot that we could take home with us over winter break and think how that might trickle down to students. Elizabeth or Jal, are there pivot points that you think people could maybe hit that might be doable as they refresh their approach to motivating or drawing out the curiosity in their students?
I'd say less is more. We've been advocating for a while for something we're calling Marie Kondoing the curriculum, which is an idea that Shanna Peoples, National Teacher of the Year, came up with in a design charrette. Marie Kondo, the Japanese decluttering expert, only keep the things that spark joy. So the more space when things are working and they, there's some space to grow them, it's never great to rush off to whatever the next thing is. And this year it seems like if anything ever like catches with students, like let it grow and go, and don't like feel pressured to do the next thing. And for folks at the administrative level, recognize the value of that and how much you would want that for your own kids. And don't be afraid that like they won't have learned standard X or Y. Like, if it's really important, there will be some other chance to learn it. And if it's just sort of nice to have, you can let it go.
Nice. Love it. Love it. Elizabeth, any pivot that you might think is inspirational?
Yeah, I think really empowering the student to feel like they have some control over their design as well, even checking in with your students and asking them for feedback. Joel actually made this point when we were chatting with him the other day, but I really stand by the idea that students feel more motivated and more engaged when they feel like they have some control over what's happening. And for very young students, that might look very different, like giving them a choice between a few options, as opposed to the older students checking in with them and getting their feedback on what's working, what's not working. And even that question, it sort of empowers them to realize they're drivers of their own learning as well, and might further encourage their motivation and engagement in the materials.
Wow, I have to say, I do feel a little better after this conversation. I want to thank you all. Geneviève, great to have you with us. Super cool perspectives. Elizabeth, welcome. Joel, thank you so much. To our audience, thank you very much for joining us. Stay in touch and check hgse.me/ednow. We will be back with a new slate of episodes in the spring. This is our last for the fall. We'll post these takeaways and share them. So much more to say on the topic, of course, but you all have given us some words that we can act on and take with us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care and stay safe.